Alrighty, so today we are going to be talking about um, the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS for short. First, what we're going to talk about is kind of the divisions that the nervous system comes from. So, obviously, we start with the central nervous system, and that's going to branch into two parts. First is um, let me take a quick glance at my notes here. Got the peripheral and the central. I'll change this to nervous system. So the central nervous system obviously is going to be like our brain and our spinal cord. And that's not exactly where we're going to focus right now. We're going to be focusing more over here on this peripheral side. So the peripheral side is going to branch into two larger subsections. First, we're going to have the autonomic and the somatic. And from there, we're going to have our parasympathetic and our sympathetic. And we're going to talk briefly about our somatic. This is where we're going to have motor and sensory. But these two things we're really not going to worry about too much right at the moment. We're going to really be focusing on the parasympathetic and the sympathetic for now. So the parasympathetic is what we call rest and digest. And the sympathetic is what we call fight or flight. Oops. And the reason we have these nicknames for the parasympathetic and the sympathetic is because the sympathetic is primarily responsible for our um, epinephrine or our norepinephrine responses whenever we are in moments of high stress or exercise or things of that nature. And then our rest and digest, which primarily comes from our vagus nerve, our nerve number 10. This is what that vagus nerve, by the way, covers 90% of our parasympathetic response. But that's what kind of controls our subconscious things like heart rate, homeostasis. Um, um, Obviously, there can be some dual innervation, and we'll get into that in a moment. But mostly, our parasympathetic just covers the things like peristalsis, for example, in the gut, or digestion, or um, things of that nature. Um, okay, points of CNS innervation. Okay, now this is going to be broken down. We're going to have this be our brain, and we're going to have this be our spinal cord. Now, this will be a fairly brief explanation from our T1 to our L2. This is where we're going to find all of our um, sympathetic fight or flight response nerves. And something too important to note here is our sympathetic is going to show us two things. Our presynaptic length is usually going to be fairly short, and it's always going to be myelinated. Well, it's a little too thick. And our postsynaptic is usually what's going to be pretty long. And what we're going to see here is our presynaptic junctions are presynaptic neurons in the sympathetic side of our nervous system, which is going to innervate like muscles and such like that. We're going to see this commonality that um, they're going to leave from this from the spinal cord here, big spinal cord. It's not very good. And what we're going to see is our parasympathetic is going to go into what we call the sympathetic chain ganglia. And it's going to leave this little ventral horn. And it's going to go into the center, into the sympathetic chain ganglia. And this right here is where it's going to be synapsing. And at this synapse point, this is where it can leave and go to an effector muscle, for example, like in the fight or flight response. And so this is just one example of kind of how we're going to see our pre and post synaptic neurons laid out. Now, in the post, or excuse me, in the parasympathetic, what we're going to see is we're going to see a really long presynaptic neuron and a much shorter postsynaptic neuron. Now, again, just like in the sympathetic nervous system, we're also going to see this common theme of this myelinated neuron at the beginning. Now, these rest or digest or these parasympathetic neurons are primarily going to be through our vagus nerve and down here in the sacral region. And so this this division between the cervical area and the sacral area is what we're going to call the craniosacral division. And that's primarily we're going to see this function of our parasympathetic and rest and digest um, neurons. Now, there is something else super important to include here, which is along with this chain ganglia, we also are going to have something called the collateral ganglia. And the collateral ganglia is um, fairly unique because we this is where we get it's almost like a junction box. And so there's a bunch of neurons that are going to come through here and they're actually going to synapse in the lateral ganglia before they leave to some sort of like effector muscle, let's say like the stomach. And through that collateral ganglia, we're going to see a completely different type of neuron pathway. Let's see, let's look back at my notes here. Autonomic and nervous. Let's see what else I want to include here. Oh yeah, when we have a preganglionic neuron, like right here, that enters and leaves the sympathetic chain ganglia without synapsing, it'll form what we call a splanchnic nerve. And so that's the other option. We can have a neuron here. I'll do it in orange. It can go in, or excuse me, it can leave the spinal nerve, and without synapsing here, it can go. There's usually a couple little routes here, and it can actually travel out the white matter into the back down the sympathetic chain ganglia, and it can actually synapse. I'm going to erase that. And it can actually synapse at a collateral. It can actually synapse at the collateral ganglia before it moves on and synapses somewhere else. And so that's another important distinction that we can make. I have a couple different types of transmitters that I'm going to need to mention here. Transmitters and actions. Oh man, this section's definitely a little bit more challenging to try and remember here. Um, the next thing that I want to bring up here is that we have a few different types of neurotransmitters that are used in between each of these ganglia, where we're going to always see between both the para and the sympathetic is that in between this pre and post, yeah, in between this pre and post sympathetic synapse, we're going to have a few different kinds of neurotransmitters here. The first one we're going to see here that's super important is what we call acetylcholine. And that's going to be found in both para and sympathetic. That's super important. Now, after this first junction between the pre and postsynaptic neuron, we're going to have a number of different other types of neurons that can be used. We can have things like um, epinephrine, we can have norepinephrine, um, and I want to say there's one more, dopamine is another common one. But with the parasympathetic, especially, we're only going to have two acetylcholine um, synapses right in the middle. Sorry about that. Um, let's see, where was I? Oh, the next thing we can talk about is I'm going to use this as a little reference note here. Is cholinergic cholinergic receptors versus adrenergic receptors. So our cholinergic receptors are receptors that will bind specifically and only to acetylcholine, as we see right here. Our adrenergic receptors can bind to both norepinephrine and epinephrine. And we kind of get those names from adrenaline, as you can kind of see right here where adrenergic comes from. Um, Now, our acetylcholine receptors have two different subunits. These are our nicotinic, that I'll highlight right here, and our muscarinic. Now, our nicotinic receptors actually derived their name from, as you guessed, nicotine. And that's because it was discovered that nicotine can indeed bind to these same binding sites. And then this came from mushrooms. And for the same reason, these sites were discovered that they could also bind to these drugs. Now, what you'll notice here is we call nicotine a ligand-gated ion channel, which means when these nicotinic N1 and N2 receptors open up, they actually allow things like alpha motor neuron and skeletal muscles to fire. So, like if you were to stretch a muscle, that's usually going to be followed through a cholinergic receptor through acetylcholine down the line to an N2 or an N1 receptor. That's where you're going to get a lot of your skeletal muscle function. Um, in the nicotinic 2 receptor, this is where you'll find a lot of autonomic, um, more autonomic receptors, but similar, like maybe smooth muscle types. The important difference here is that nicotinic receptors work through ligand-gated ion channels, whereas muscarinic receptors work through these G protein coupled receptors, and that's a large difference to remember. Now we move over here to our adrenergic receptors. We have um, our alpha and our beta. Now there's only two main alpha protocols that were, excuse me, alpha, what's the word? Alpha receptors that we need to worry about, and that's alpha 1 and alpha 2, and then beta 1, 2, and 3. And these are all going to have different primary bodily functions that we see in the body, meaning that each of these receptors are we're going to find primarily on different parts of the body. For example, our alpha 1 receptor is super common for, oh, excuse me, beta 1 receptor is super common for controlling the heart with sympathetic neuron function. However, beta 2 controls the lungs. So even right there, even within something as close together as the cardiovascular system, different receptors will control different areas of those um, different areas of the body. Now, let me see. I'm gonna pull up a different note here. Another important thing to remember is the nicotinic. This is what we're gonna find on the cell bodies of postganglionic. So this is postganglionic cell bodies. And then this is where we're going to see the, like I mentioned earlier, the entering of sodium ions. So that's why it was important to remember that they affected skeletal muscle. And lastly, let's see, muscarinic receptors. Oh yeah, here's a really good thing to bring into that I almost forgot about. Muscarinic doesn't control things like for example, it doesn't control skeletal muscle, but it does control things like the eyes and dilation of the pupils. Um, Next, for the adrenergic receptors, these are going to bind to things that we call another important nickname that I had to remember here is these are called catecholamines. In the middle of this, babe, of catecholamines. Um, this is just a category that is used to describe norepinephrine and epinephrine. Um, yeah, alpha, we're going to typically find on, we'll make a little note here. Alpha 1, we're going to see primarily affect smooth muscle. And alpha 2, if I remember correctly, I'm trying to remember. Oh, yeah. Another good rule of thumb that would be important to remember is that odd numbered receptors usually have inhibitory effects, and even excitatory effects. Let me make sure I picked everything else up. Oh, actually, I think I got that wrong. Oops, I got that wrong. Sorry. Odd usually have anyway. So those are two important rules to remember. And if I remember correctly, that should be everything I needed to mention in this video. Yeah. So yeah, obviously wasn't perfect, but should work for the time being.